Well, I expect you've probably guessed our theme today. It is, of course, one of LGBTQ plus inclusion. It is also the joy of Transfiguration Sunday. So this naturally made this preach with these two themes a challenge to write. When John told me over a week ago, that I would be preaching, I had to start thinking of what to say. So Josh and I reviewed the texts, and we came to the text that John just read to us. Readings of love, readings of purpose, readings of God's glory, both through us, through Jesus, and through others. What I bring to you now is my attempt at linking these two wonderful themes together: transfiguration and inclusion. Who do you stand with? On first appearance, it's a simple enough question, isn't it? Who do you stand with? As we journey through this life and this walk with Jesus, we begin to align with people. Which denomination do you go to? Which theological tradition do you belong to? Which political party do you watch, hoping will win the next election? We all fall into a series of categories. Whether that category is one that goes against other categories and is itself a category, it doesn't matter. I said just now, this is the joy of Transfiguration Sunday, and it is a joyous occasion. We are celebrating the time when Jesus took his disciples up the holy mountain and it was transfigured before them. It represents the end of the season of Epiphany, which began with a burst of light that shone as a star in the sky for the Magi to see from afar, and now ends with another burst of light. A burst of light which is so glorious and so amazing that when it's covered, it's terrifying. The light which transforms shows Peter, James, and John who Jesus really is. A confirmation that is shown when the voice from heaven proclaims, "This is my chosen, listen to him." There's a lot to say in this passage. An awful lot. One that I could probably lecture you on for another hour. I doubt most of you would enjoy it, but I might. But we'll focus on just one theme. I want to point out who was Jesus standing with. We're told that he appeared with two figures. And as the disciples are dozing off, just about to hit that point where you're just falling asleep, and then you jump awake, they see these two wonderful figures. And who are they? But Moses and Elijah. Two great prophets of the Jewish tradition. Moses, who led the children of Israel into physical freedom and gave them the law. So likewise, Jesus leads us out of spiritual captivity and summed up the law and the prophets, saying, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself." He also stood with Elijah, the great prophet who challenged the prophets of Baal to set the altar alight, and when it didn't, allowed them to proclaim the existence of Yahweh. He also warned us of the idols that we all fall into and all bind us, the idols that we unwittingly go to day after day. Something that Jesus would do to an even greater depth. These are two figures well known to the Jewish tradition, but to us today as well, as two people that went against the grain. Two people who stood up, stood against, and proclaimed the voice of the weak, of the excluded. Jesus was the third part, the third figure. Luke tells us that they spoke of his coming trial, of what would happen in Jerusalem, that he would be tried, executed, arrested, tried, executed, and then he would rise again. Luke tells us later on of the pain that Jesus went through and how he was strengthened to the point that he gave up and went for a sacrifice. Jesus was yet another who proclaims a hard message for a hard time. So I want to ask you, if you were in this passage, up a mountain, who would you see yourself standing with? Would it be people who have built you up? Who have mentored you? Who have helped you along the way? In your faith? In your life? Or maybe your work? Would it be the excluded? Those that you've journeyed along with? Those you've stood up for? Or would it be those that you're closest to? Those that you love? And those that you cherish more than anything? Now, I love the church. I do. That's why I'm training to be a minister in it. It really pains me to see this and to see the amount of hate that goes around on the world. On the whole, the church has not been good at standing up, at speaking out for those who are excluded, for fighting for freedom, equality, and inclusion. Whether this be racism, sexism, or anything else. People asking, crying out for help and protection. Is the church against racism? They cry. The church whispers. Yeah, we're kind of against that. But it's 2022, isn't it? Nearly 50 decades after that famous case of Stephen Lawrence, which still goes on to this day, and we're still talking and unpacking racism. It was only 2 years ago, less than, that George Floyd was murdered. Racism is still real. Sexism is still real in the church and in life. So I say that the church can speak louder, can use the gospel that they've been given to proclaim a different message, a message that is against that. A voice that instead of mumbling, shouts from the rooftops. A voice of vitality and conviction. A voice not of fundamentalism, but of plain truths of what we've been told. We kind of stand with people, but it's a weak Droop-shouldered stance. It's a stance where we got the back door open. That when the rubbish happens, when it all goes wrong, we can run away. Instead of standing with these people, we have ended up keeping them in bondage. Of course, there are exceptions. Martin Luther King Jr. came from this very denomination, as did so many others who fought and continue to fight for civil rights. And Josh just listed a few of those in his presentation for us, of who stand up, who bring their faith and their self and their identity together in one brilliant job inclusion walk. But on the whole, the church's response has been one of tepidness. It remains today one of the bulwarks of racism, and Sunday remains perhaps the most segregated day in America. And it's been similar, sad to say, in our stance against sexism. There are still churches who think women can't be leaders. There are still churches who think women can't preach. Again, the church has provided some place for women to develop their gifts and to lead, but on the whole, when it speaks that voice, it has mumbled around for decades, and very often those in the church who would keep women subservient have spoken much louder and with greater conviction. Now, on this point, it is noted that the Baptist Union is currently doing a brilliant research project, Project Violet, which is helping women ministers and is examining why there aren't more, and is increasing the number of women ministers in the denomination. Named, of course, after Violet Hedger, who was a minister who trained at Regent's College. Now, the ultimate example of this church's lukewarmness, whispering voice, its slack-shouldered stance, was in Nazi Germany. Again, there was opposition. Again, there was standing up. But on the whole, it was trampled. The wonderful theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he begins with this startling sentence: "The great enemy of the church today is cheap grace." We want all the advantages of grace. We want the love. We want the kindness. We want the stance in heaven. But we don't want to do any for it. We don't want to stand with people, speak up for them. We don't want to risk our necks. Bonhoeffer was executed after he was arrested, converted his prison guard, was released, arrested again, wrote some more letters, and then finally died in the concentration camp a few weeks before the end of the war. Another leader of the same church, the Confessing Church, was Martin Niemöller. He uttered these famous words: "When they came for the communists, I didn't say anything because I'm not a communist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I'm a Christian. When they came for the trade unionists, I didn't say anything because I don't belong to a trade union. And then they came for me, and it was too late. There was no one to speak up for me." Niemöller spent 7 years in a concentration camp before the end of the war, and writing a countless number of volumes until his death in the 80s. So I want to say to you today, we can speak louder. We can amplify our voice for and stand stronger with those who are excluded. And today that specific focus is on LGBTQ plus people. But why stop there? Why stop the transfiguration of relationships there? Why not stand stronger for the disabled, for the refugees, for those who are on the streets, for those who fight for their lives on the streets of Ukraine? Is that not what Jesus calls us to do? We can speak louder and stand with people stronger. And I want to say this isn't a thing that I am free from. I've sat in many sermons where we've been called for evangelism, where I've been asked time and time again to stand with those who are excluded. It's so easy to conform, to not take the steps. But there's more. We consider this church a family, don't we? And of course, in families, there are two things we're warned never to talk about. I can see John smiling. He knows where I'm going with this. Politics and religion. It's strange, isn't it? So we don't even really want to talk about religion in a church. We're afraid of splitting the church. We're afraid of the fragmentation that so often comes with disagreement. But that's because we haven't yet learned to live with the diversity that church is. This church in particular, I think, prides itself on its diversity. It is among one of the more diverse congregations I've been part of. But diversity is more than just race, ethnicity, age, and the like. It's diversity of opinion, whether this be political, social, or theological. But most of us want to be in a church where we believe the same stuff, where everyone thinks alike, because that's more comforting. But that's a club, not a church. And this is important, and I want to show you how important this is. And I believe unless more churches speak up louder, take stronger stands now, and it's possible we could be still talking about this full inclusion of LGBT+, of race, of gender, of opinion years from now. But unlike racism, sexism, I think our society as a whole, and especially its young people, have already moved in terms of LGBTQ+ inclusion. They're for it, and they don't see why we're fussing over it. So when society, and especially its young, see us still arguing the question of inclusion years from now, the church's weak stand will make it seem to more and more people that we don't just have a weak voice. We have an irrelevant voice. This is not something that this church has been totally neglecting. As a church, you have been inclusive for so many years. You have completed the Creating Sanctuary course. You have done so much. What I am saying is there is still so much to do. I will leave you with the words, hopefully encouraging words, of Josh's newsletter. He writes, "In New Road, I found a congregation where not only did it not matter whether I was LGBT+, the church had actively sought to affirm those members of its congregation in their ministry. It is so important to me that New Road has actively acknowledged the harm done to the rainbow community, and that we as a church, in covenant with each other, continue to learn from each other's stories, for me and for others within our student community at New Road. It is the affirming stance that the church holds to that has actively encouraged us to walk through the door and to keep coming. May we go forth in God's grace to stand with those who are trampled upon. Amen.